looking at the text, looking at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And I want to do that through the lens of looking at Abraham and his offering or binding of Isaac. And in doing that, I want to focus not so much on the crucifixion in and of itself, but the effects of the crucifixion. And so I want to look beyond the crucifixion in what the crucifixion is meant to accomplish in me and in you. I'm going to be very clear from the outset on what one of the main features of the cross is. And that is this: Jesus died to empty us entirely of us and have us place all our hope in the God of resurrection. So Jesus' death, one of the main features of Jesus' death, is to kill us or empty us of us and cause us to place all our hope in the God of resurrection. This is the idea. So on the cross of Calvary, it was not just Jesus that was to die. It was each of us with him on the cross. This is the significance of Paul when he writes in Romans 6, we know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. And so I want you to catch this. While Jesus' death was a one-time, unique death on Calvary, that one death was meant to bring about millions of other deaths. Look at it like an avalanche, that once that initial snow begins to fall, it brings with it much other snow, all types of other snow with it. And this is in effect what Jesus' death was supposed to do. It was supposed to bring about our deaths to our old selves. So Christ's death was meant to bring about countless other deaths, namely yours and mine. And we see this in Jesus' very frank and pointed, sobering words when he says this in Luke 9. And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Let me read that one more time. And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So I want you to see this. I want you to catch this, that in Jesus' death, we were to die with him. It's very easy to look at Good Friday and say, oh yeah, that's the day Jesus died. But not to think simultaneously with that, that was the day that I died. My old self died. The old person with all his habits and all his tendencies that everybody around him knew all too well, all of those sinful ways died then too. This is the significance of Jesus' death. And so we want to answer the question, what does it look like to die daily? What does that look like in daily terms, in moment-to-moment terms? Well, as we're in Genesis and we're getting into Genesis 22, I think one of the clearest depictions of what it looks like to die daily is to take a look at our man Abraham and how he died effectively before God. And how did Abraham die exactly before God and yet go on living? Well, Abraham died, and we're going to see how he died tonight, by how he gave up his two boys, how he gave up Ishmael and Isaac. and how he laid them on the altar before God. You got to understand that these two boys were Abraham's hope within hope. They were his hope wrapped up, clearly seen in these two boys. And he gave each of them up before God. These were his most precious items. And so as we look through Genesis 21 and 22 and see how Abraham gave up these two boys, I want you to think about how you give your life up on a daily basis, whatever that is. Whatever seemingly minuscule items it is that you give up before the Lord. I want you to think of those as Abraham gives up his two boys. We looked only at verses 1 through 7 in Genesis 21 so far, and this evening we're going to jump from verse 7 a little bit through 21 and then straight into 22, and we're going to come back after Easter and pick up the rest of chapter 21 in more detail. But after the birth of Isaac, an incident comes up that causes Sarah to be so shaken over Ishmael that she begs Abraham to send him away. And Abraham goes to God, and God says, listen to your wife Sarah and send him away. And we'll talk much more about that in the weeks to come. But I want you to see this first giving up of a son as not being Isaac. The first one that Abraham gave up was Ishmael. And we know that this was extremely painful for Abraham. Ishmael was a teenager. So I want you to think of boys like Matthew McLaughlin, Malachi Willie, Tristan Wilcox, this sort of age, because this would have been where Ishmael would have been. And in those years, imagine the relationships that Jason and James and Sam are able to have with these boys at that age. This would have been the age that Ishmael was at when God calls him to give him up. And we know from a few different points in the scripture that this was extremely painful for Abraham. First, we know that Abraham and Sarah were so desperate for a son. That's how Ishmael was born, that they went too fast. But we know that even when we make a mistake and go too fast in doing something, it's not easy to relinquish what we just did and let it go. Beyond that, when God himself tells Abraham that Sarah is going to have a son and Ishmael is not going to be the heir apparent, Abraham begs God to not have it be Isaac, but to have it be Ishmael. And so you know how dear Ishmael was to Abraham's heart. Beyond that, when Sarah comes to Abraham, the text says, and she begs him to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, the text says that this was very displeasing to Abraham. And Genesis, we've known so far, is very discreet. It doesn't elaborate. And so when it says something, it means what it says. And so when that was said to Abraham, and the text says that it was very displeasing to Abraham to give up Ishmael, we know that it was. And then he goes to God and he says, God, what am I going to do? And he says, listen to your wife and give him up. And the text says that Abraham rose early the next morning. And the text leaves us to wonder, did Abraham rise early in the morning to do this painful deed because he was just strictly obedient to God? Or did he rise early in the morning because he couldn't sleep? The last time Abraham rose early in the morning was when he rose up early to go see Sodom and Gomorrah, waiting to see what God did to these cities. And you sensed that it was a rising out of angst, a sleeplessness. And so was it the same here? We'll see in the next chapter in 22 where he tells him to sacrifice Isaac, that then too he rose early in the morning. And so what we see is great turmoil in Abraham. But what's significant for our purposes this evening is Abraham, by God's grace, was dying to everything that wasn't God in his life. And Jesus' death was meant to do that in me and in you, to cause us to die to everything that's not God. That's what it's meant to do. So Abraham, in this moment, in saying goodbye to Hagar and Ishmael, was being stripped of one more earthly reliance, one more earthly hope that was a hope aside from God. And he said goodbye to it. He laid his dream of Ishmael at the feet of God, trusting the rightness and goodness of God's decision in that parting severance. And you got to imagine that when Abraham said goodbye to Ishmael and he turned around, Isaac must have grown that much dearer to him. As he kissed Ishmael goodbye, Isaac must have grown in his affection, grown in his reliance, and in his hope on this then 2 or 3-year-old little boy. But when we come to Genesis 22, Isaac's grown. You can go ahead and picture those 3 boys again, because the same term that's used of Ishmael is now in the Hebrew used of Isaac. And with that in mind, I want to pause and read from the scriptures this evening for our passage. And it might be a little dark to read from your own Bibles, but if you'd stand with me as I read from Genesis 22. And as I read, I want you to imagine that Isaac's not 2 or 3. He's a teenager likely. He's one that's old enough to carry wood. He's one that can reason with his father and talk with him. And this is what takes place. I'll be reading verses 1 through 12. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. You may be seated. I want to reiterate before we work through this text the point of tonight, and that is in the point of Jesus' death. is to cause an emptying of ourselves, of anything that's not God, and placing our entire hope on the God of resurrection. And tonight, we're going to focus on that emptying of ourselves of anything but God. And on Easter Sunday, we're going to focus on how Abraham hoped in the God of resurrection in this passage. But for right now, I want to focus on the death, not of Isaac, but the death of Abraham. Because that's what God is effectively doing in this text. This isn't about slaying Isaac. It's about slaying Abraham and any false hopes, false reliances that he had other than God. And this is the very thing that Jesus' death is meant to bring about in you and in me. So, how did God begin killing Abraham in this passage? Well, we already noticed that Abraham died in his reliance on Ishmael. And what that brought about was probably a more firm reliance on Isaac. But what we see in this passage is God narrowing down his reliance to be solely on God. Not on Isaac, not on anything else but him. And so he's stripping him away slowly and painstakingly of anything but God. The text makes clear that God is testing Abraham. So immediately when the reader reads that, it should dismiss any belief that God's going to actually have him kill his son. So the reader knows right from the get-go that God is not a God that's for child sacrifice. This is a test. But we know that God's tests are not easy. Commentator Gordon Wenham puts it this way: God's tests were meant to show what someone is really like. And it generally involves difficulty and hardship. And friends, this is what God is doing with you and with me right now in whatever's going on in our lives. He's meaning to show us those parts of us that are still us and not him. And he frequently does that through pain. He did it for Israel in the wilderness. He stripped them of food, of water, of shelter, of protection, of weaponry, so that they might rely fully on him. But first, so that he might test them to see if they would rely fully on him. And of course, they did or they didn't. They didn't. But what about Abraham? How did God test Abraham? Well, what you'll find as I sort of comb through this text and pull out every point of testing, you'll see how absolutely thorough God's tests are. How he looks into every nook and cranny of Abraham's soul in order to cleanse him of anything that's left in Abraham but God, but reliance on God. There's a purging taking place here. How does it happen? Well, first he has him say goodbye to Ishmael. Second, now that his hope is firmly relied on Isaac, God says to him almost verbatim what he said to him back in Genesis 12 when he first called him. The phrasing is almost identical. He says to him, "Go forth by yourself to the land I will show you." That's what he tells him in Genesis 12. In Genesis 22, it's almost verbatim. He says, "Go forth by yourself to the land of Moriah. On one of the heights I will point out to you." So it's the same sort of phrase. He's bringing Abraham back to his point of initial conversion, as it were. And friends, this is the very same thing he does with us time and time again. He brings us back to where our hope is just as heavily on him as it was at our initial salvation. There's only 2 times in the Old Testament where this phrase is used, so it must be significant. And there's a bitter tone to this. Because when God first told Abraham to go forth, that was saturated with a promise that I'm going to make you a father of many nations. And so after Genesis 12, you're waiting for this fatherhood. You're waiting for this son. And Isaac finally comes, and now God's saying to him, kill that one. And so for Abraham, it's as though these last 25 years or 35 years, 40 years were just completely wasted. Because now this one that he waited for these 40 some years is going to be killed. And so he's seemingly bringing back to square one. On top of this, when he told him back in Genesis 12 to go forward, there were lots of promises, lots of hope. But now, there's no promises. It's just go and offer your son as a burnt offering. No hope whatsoever. Remember hearing about when Philip Yancey had finished an entire manuscript of one of his books, and somehow he lost it. Completely gone. No backups. Just a glimmer of what Abraham was feeling here. All the promises were on Isaac. And now he's saying, kill the boy. Sidney Gradenius says this: it's as though God asked Abraham to burn all his bridges when he left Haran, and now he's asking him to burn all the bridges in front of him. So he's just left where he is with God. So the first is we see this similarity between the call at the beginning and the call now. Next, we see at the beginning God stressed how he would be leaving his family. Listen to how God tells him to leave in Genesis 12. He says he wants you to leave from your country, your people, and your father's household. So he's stressing to Abraham, this is what I want to cut you off from and separate you to myself. But now listen to how he tells him to slay Isaac. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. So he's stressing the family connection before he cuts it off. Next, God could have had Abraham sacrifice Isaac when he was young. But instead he waited till he was an older son. Memories, personality, deep affection, intimacy. On top of this, had he slayed Isaac when he was young, Isaac may not even have known what was going on. But now Isaac does know what's going on. He's able to talk to his dad about what's happening. He's acknowledging what's taking place. He's aware. You're seeing how God tests. Next, Abraham lived in a culture that actually participated in child sacrifice. And so there was a degree in which Abraham thought maybe God is like these other false gods. Maybe he does stuff like this. Beyond that, God could have had him sacrifice Isaac immediately, but instead he chooses a place that's 3 days away. Why 3 days? Why the pain of travel? Why not just get it over with right now where I don't even have to think about it? Why the delay? But again, he's seeking to probe into Abraham's heart. He's seeking to cleanse every bit of Abraham out of Abraham so that his hope is totally on God and he has time to think about it. Many of you know when an unfavorable test comes back from the doctor, and so another test is necessary, but you have to wait for that test. The waiting is the painful part. Next, God has Abraham choose a route where Abraham will see the mountain from a distance. And so he's able to anticipate the pain from far out, as if the 3 days weren't long enough. He sees where it has to be done off in the distance, heightening the pain. Beyond that, the name Isaac in this passage is mentioned 4 times. The words for son is mentioned 10 times. And for the reader, this heightens the pain of Abraham as we're entertained by this thought of Isaac and this son over and over and over again. Beyond that, he's called to perform a burnt offering. We understand what a burnt offering is as we read on through the Old Testament. The sacrifice's throat would be slit, its innards would be removed, and it would be burned in its entirety. Not a single shred of the sacrifice left. Totally consumed, as if it never existed. This is what God is calling Abraham to do. And the reader knows he's not going to go through with it. But Abraham doesn't. And then the text goes to great lengths with this dialogue between Isaac and Abraham to show the pain, to cause the pain to rise up. Text points out that Abraham carried the fire and the knife in his very own hands. And friends, I just want to pause. And I just want your brains to go to the pain in your life. Past, present, and future. And I want you to know why that pain exists. That pain exists to strip you, to empty you entirely of you, so that you might lean fully on God. To take every atom that's left of you and replace it with hope in God. To probe to the most deepest, most intimate parts of our souls, so that we might rely in those innermost private places wholly on God. To strip us of every hope apart from Him. To identify every false idol, to shine the spotlight on every arrogance in which we rest or put confidence, to drag out from us, from every dark corner, the sins that we defend and excuse because we find solace in them apart from God. He wants us to be stripped of putting our confidence even in those things that are the fruit of our obedience, the fruit of righteousness. Just as Isaac was for Abraham, that was a fruit of faith. It was very easy for Abraham to put that itself before God and have God be second to Isaac. God wants us to feel our complete destitution without Him, our hopelessness and void were He to vanish, our readiness to collapse if He steps away. This is the desired destination of Mount Moriah. This is the desired death, not of Isaac, but of Abraham. Isaac's binding could serve as an illustration of God binding Abraham on this mountain and effectively slitting his throat to the dreams that didn't rely on God as firmly as God wanted them to rely on Himself. And this is what Jesus' death was meant to do in us. You see, this last Sunday, we compared the birth of Isaac, and who wouldn't celebrate that birth? We compared that to Jesus' triumphal entry. Who wouldn't have celebrated Jesus' triumphal entry? You've got the Messiah coming. He's doing miracles. The thought buzzing around is that He's going to liberate them from Rome. This is what's so exciting. But how many people were there at the cross? Even of His own disciples. How many identified with Jesus in His death? How many said, I am ready to die with Him, and then stuck through with it instead of run away? And you see, friends, it can be the very same thing when Jesus holds out for us in eternity with Him, and we all say, yes, sign me up for that. But when it comes down to giving up your life on this earth, which Jesus came to bring about, we renege. we back away, we cower in fear. And friends, Jesus' death came to bring about a death to all of those fears, to all of that selfishness that still remains in us, so that we might be free from sin. This is the beauty of what Paul says in Romans 6, that we died with him. That's the idea of baptism, of going down into the waters. That's the symbol of us dying with Jesus on the cross. And this is what God is seeking to bring about in us right now through the death of Jesus Christ. That he who is faithful to begin a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. And so, when your selfishness is pointed out to you, when your fears are identified, know that that is God showing you who you still are and saying, we still have to work on that. We still have to rid you of that. And when pain comes into your life and you think it's a foreign entrance, know that it's not foreign, that it's from God to cleanse what remains of you, so that you might put your hope fully on him and not any place else. Just what God is doing with Abraham, he's doing with us. And this supper that we're about to partake of Jesus' broken body in the bread and his poured out blood in the cup, this is the death that signifies our death as well. That we lay aside those former passions. We lay aside that unforgiveness that we're not extending to other people. We lay aside those dreams that weren't carved out by God, but were carved out by us. And we say, God, I am at your disposal. You notice the 3 times in this text that Abraham is simply saying, here am I. Here am I. I am being freed from me, and I'm presenting myself wholly to God. This was the significance of the burnt offering throughout Israel's history. It was offered in the morning by the priest, and it was offered in the evening, every day by the priest. And the significance of the burnt offering, of its being wholly consumed, was to say to God, I'm all yours. I'm all yours. There's nothing left. I'm at your disposal. Whatever you want from me, I want to put in your hands. That's where I want all of me. I don't want to hold anything back. That's the significance of the burnt offering. And Abraham giving up Isaac is a perfect picture of that laying down all things before the Lord. I've shared with you before of the unbelievable work that God did through a puny little man named George Mueller, and how many orphans that God used George Mueller to house and care for. And then when he retired in his 70s, he went to go and be a missionary for the remaining years of his life, something he always wanted to do. The amount of times he preached each day, just absolutely mind-boggling how God could use such a tiny little vessel of George Mueller. And someone asked him one day, what was the secret? How did God use you so mightily? And his initial answer began like this: there was a day when George Mueller died. That's how he began. And friends, that's how God wants us to begin. Not just at our salvation, but every single day, according to Jesus' words in Luke 9. Must take up his cross and follow me daily. And if he meant daily, did he not mean every moment of every day? This is what Jesus called to bring about in our lives through his death on the cross. And so as I ask the musicians to come on up, and as we go to the table, I want you to think circumspectly about your life. and saying, God, I know you want to empty me out like you emptied Abraham out. And I know I'm fighting back. And I want you to free me of these things and cleanse me of me.